He found the wild Mustang trapped in a steel snare, its frantic cries echoing off the canyon walls. For him, there was no turning back. No matter the risk, he had to save that horse or watch it die. Before we get into this story, let us know where you're watching from, and subscribe for more tales like this one. We upload every day at the same time. The clank of metal against shifting rock was the first thing he heard as he crested a jagged ridge. He'd been fighting against an unrelenting wind all afternoon, the kind of wind that burned the skin, drew tears, and made every step a struggle. The sky above was slate gray, the sun nearly swallowed by rolling clouds that threatened a downpour. But the endless desert plains below gave no hint of shelter, only the ominous shapes of boulders and the stark silhouettes of distant mountains. Each breath he took felt razor-thin, slicing his lungs as he trudged forward. In that vast emptiness, he could have easily missed the sight of the Mustang if not for the horse's shrill whinny, which carried on the wind like a desperate plea. He slid down loose gravel, nearly losing his footing. His boots caught on sharp stones, and the dust kicked up around him. There, tucked near a splintered juniper trunk, a wild Mustang lay tangled in wire. Its legs were flailing, nostrils wide with terror. The snare had cut deep into the horse's flesh, oozing blood that stained the dirt red beneath it. The horse was large, its muscles twitching in pain and panic. Each time it bucked, the metal trap's chain rattled, sending pebbles flying in all directions. This was no small wound. If he didn't act, the Mustang would bleed out or snap its leg trying to get free. He steadied himself, heart hammering as he took in the situation. He had a small backpack with limited supplies, a flask of water, a pocket knife, some rope, and a few snacks, definitely not enough to handle a serious medical emergency. But there was no time to think of the lack of supplies. The horse's eyes were wide, rolling in its skull, the whites gleaming with panic. Its muzzle flared in short, desperate bursts. The man felt his own adrenaline spike. Danger was thick in the air. He could sense that each second counted, and the desert sun, though hidden behind clouds, was beginning to set in the distance. Nightfall in this place would bring an onslaught of cold and predators. He approached cautiously. The horse kicked at him with savage force, the hoof missing his chest by inches. He staggered back, heart pounding as he realized just how close that blow had come to caving in his ribs. The Mustang was in pain, but it was also wild, untrusting of humans, and cornered. The slightest wrong move might get him killed. He took a moment to center himself, breathing in dust and grit, trying to project calm. His mouth felt parched, and sweat trickled down his brow despite the dropping temperature. One false move, one step too close at the wrong moment, and he'd be crushed under those hooves or slashed by that trap's steel edges. He forced himself to speak softly, though his voice quavered. Words poured out in hushed reassurance, meaningless, perhaps, but the tone was gentle. The Mustang's ears twitched, and for a fleeting moment, its eyes locked with his. The trembling horse stilled, as if trying to understand whether he was a threat or a savior. Carefully, he inched closer, sliding his hand along the rope at his belt. He reached out slowly, letting the horse catch his scent. When he was close enough to see the dark sheen of its coat, he felt the heat radiating off the exhausted creature. Its breath was ragged, puffs of steam curling in the cold desert air. Reaching for the wire, his fingers brushed blood, sticky and warm. He almost gagged from the metallic smell, but he steeled himself. He tested the tension in the trap. It was tough and poorly rigged, likely meant for smaller game, not a horse of this size. Yet the Mustang's thrashing had tightened it further. Every time the horse jerked, the wire bit deeper. He rummaged for his pocket knife, cursing under his breath when he felt how dull the blade had become. This wasn't going to be easy. He had to cut carefully, or risk worsening the gash. The Mustang's breathing came in rough gasps, eyes rolling back when another spasm of pain hit. Night was closing in. The sky, once just overcast, turned a brooding shade of purple. An eerie stillness settled around them, broken only by the occasional gust of wind that made the juniper creak. He could already imagine the creatures that would emerge after sundown: coyotes, mountain lions, and who knew what else, all drawn to the scent of blood. Time was slipping away. He had to move faster. He swallowed hard and set to work on the wire, ignoring how the Mustang twitched every time the trap's metal shifted. His first attempt to saw through the wire did little more than scratch the surface. Sweat trickled into his eyes, stinging them. His hand trembled with the effort, but he pressed harder. The blade squealed against the steel. The Mustang's legs kicked out again, nearly catching him in the shoulder. He bit back a shout, pivoting just in time to avoid a direct hit. His foot slipped on loose gravel, and he slammed hard onto his knee. Pain tore through him, but he couldn't stop. Gritting his teeth, he braced himself for another attempt. Blood was smeared across his forearms now. Whether it was the horse's or his own from minor cuts, he couldn't be sure. He made a mental note: if he freed the Mustang, there'd still be the matter of patching up that wound. Though what he'd do after that, he had no idea. Drag the horse through the desert? Find a trail back to some outpost? He'd worry about that when it came. First, he had to get this trap off. The wire was thick, but slowly, inexorably, the blade chewed through. Sparks flew when he angled it wrong. The Mustang let out a strangled whinny, thrashing its neck. He paused to let the horse catch its breath, and to steady his trembling hands. The dryness in his mouth had become unbearable. He took a sip from his flask, the water only a trickle. He knew he had to ration every drop, but his throat felt as parched as the dust beneath him. Squinting at the horizon, he noticed the sun's last light disappearing behind jagged peaks. The shadows were elongating, the temperature dropping by the minute. A heavy hush fell over the desert, the kind that brought a primal sense of unease. He felt it deep in his bones. This was a race against nature. Knife in hand, he resumed his desperate work. His breath came in shallow gasps from exertion. Finally, with a last twist, the wire snapped. Relief flooded him, but it lasted only a second. The Mustang jerked violently at the sudden release, nearly dragging him across the rocky ground. He scrambled back, heart hammering as the horse tried to stand. One back leg wobbled dangerously, the muscles not responding well, the wound ugly and bleeding. The Mustang stumbled, crumpled to its knees, then tried again. Its eyes gleamed with fierce determination, fueled by raw survival instinct. Wiping sweat and blood from his brow, he moved closer, carefully sliding one arm around the horse's neck. The animal snorted, flinching, but let him provide a bit of balance. A few tense seconds passed, then the Mustang managed to stand, shaking from head to tail. The trap lay crumpled on the ground, streaked with gore. Though freed, the Mustang was far from safe. The wound was oozing thick, dark blood, and the horse leaned on its good leg. If the bleeding didn't stop, the animal could collapse in minutes or be too weak to fend off predators. He tore a strip from his jacket, fumbling as he tried to create a makeshift bandage. The Mustang pinned its ears back, looking ready to bolt, but the pain must have outweighed its fear. It allowed him, in halting motions, to wrap the cloth around the torn flesh. Each touch made it toss its head in protest. He muttered quiet words, anything soothing, though his voice wavered with exhaustion. The desert around them seemed to hold its breath, as if watching this fragile moment. The man knew he'd have to find a more secure spot before full darkness. The canyon walls cast twisted shadows, and a breeze rattled the sparse bushes. He glanced up at the sky. The storm clouds were moving in thicker, blotting out the remaining twilight. Thunder rumbled in the distance. If it rained, the gully they were in could flood, turning into a death trap of rushing water. The Mustang trembled, and he felt its muscles tense. He took a few steps back to give it space. Part of him dreaded that it might dash off into the night, injured and alone, but it stayed put, pawing the ground in restless pain. "Come on," he mumbled, mostly to himself. He tugged gently on the rope at his belt, unsure if he could guide the Mustang anywhere. The horse eyed him, ears shifting. The stench of blood hung thickly, a signal to every predator within miles. He shuddered, imagining wolf packs or cougars creeping closer under the cover of darkness. He had no real weapon, just his knife, and that was barely enough to fend off a determined predator. They had to move to higher ground, somewhere less exposed. The Mustang let out a ragged snort, then, surprising him, took a hesitant step in his direction. His relief was momentary. As they moved slowly along the canyon's edge, each step forced the Mustang to limp, blood dripping onto the dusty ground. The man led carefully, scanning for any semblance of a trail. His goal was a rocky outcrop he'd spotted earlier. If they could climb onto it, they'd have a vantage point, maybe more safety. The wind picked up, carrying the distant cry of some wild animal. The Mustang stiffened, ears perking, eyes flaring wide. He took a deep breath, fighting his own rising panic. Fear was an invisible noose tightening around his throat, urging him to run. But he couldn't. He had to keep calm, or they'd both be lost in the darkness, easy pickings for whatever hunted the night. They inched forward, each footstep an act of will. Loose stones clattered down steep embankments. The ground felt like it could crumble at any moment. He used his free hand to steady himself, grabbing onto sparse tufts of grass or jagged rocks that cut into his palms. The Mustang followed, though every so often it slipped and let out a pained grunt. The man's throat tightened each time. He wished he could speak some universal language that would make the horse understand he wanted to help, not harm. All he had was gentle murmuring and a firm but guiding hand. Minutes felt like hours. The sky went pitch black, stars veiled by storm clouds. A flicker of lightning illuminated the horizon, and thunder rumbled, closer this time. He pressed on, adrenaline spurring him. They climbed a series of jagged stone ledges until they reached a small plateau. It wasn't perfect, but it offered some elevation. The man used his flashlight, a small, battery-powered one he always kept in his pack, to scan the area. Boulders lay scattered about, and one side of the plateau backed against a sheer rock face. It seemed stable enough. He doubted any large predator would approach from above. At least here, they wouldn't be in direct sight of every hungry creature prowling below. He helped the Mustang settle in a spot near the rock face, the horse visibly shaking with pain and fatigue. He let himself collapse next to it, chest heaving, limbs trembling from exertion. The first drops of rain pattered on the ground. A cold gust made the hair on his arms stand. He shrugged off his pack, rummaging through it for anything useful, a spare cloth, antiseptic wipes, a small coil of bandages he'd almost forgotten about. His mind was a blur of triage and worry. He swore under his breath when he realized how meager his medical supplies were. Still, he had to try. With trembling hands, he peeled back the torn jacket cloth from the Mustang's leg. Blood had already soaked through. The horse tensed at the renewed pressure, eyes flashing white in pain. Lightning lit the sky again, and he glimpsed the severity of the gash. The wire had cut in deep, muscle exposed. He did what he could, cleaning the wound with antiseptic and then rewrapping it with Rio bandages. It was a crude patch job, but it would have to suffice. When he finished, he sat back, breath ragged, and listened to the Mustang's labored breathing. The horse quivered, steam rising from its coat in the chilly air. Rain came heavier now, droplets drumming on the plateau. His clothes were damp, and the temperature plummeted further. He needed to keep himself warm, too. Hypothermia could set in if he wasn't careful. He rummaged for something to start a fire, but everything was damp, and the wind was fierce. He cursed again under his breath. The horse watched him with dark, reflective eyes. He pulled out a thermal blanket, one of those emergency sheets that folded up small but could reflect body heat. It rustled as he tried to wrap it around his shoulders, the metallic edges catching the lightning flashes. He shivered, teeth chattering, forcing himself to think. They needed warmth, safety, and rest. Each was in short supply. Yet, despite the dire situation, he felt a strange surge of hope. The horse was alive, and that mattered. Something about the Mustang's courage, its willingness to stand despite the pain, rekindled his determination. They weren't out of danger, but as long as the horse stood, there was a chance. He leaned against the rock face, letting the Mustang have a bit of space. Rain splashed off the boulders, creating tiny rivulets that shimmered in the flashlight's beam. Lightning flickered again, casting the plateau in stark relief. For a moment, he saw how battered the Mustang truly was. Its flank was streaked with mud and blood, its chest heaving. And yet, it remained upright, ears flicking at every distant thunderclap. He closed his eyes briefly, exhaustion tugging at him. But sleep was a luxury he couldn't afford. He had to remain vigilant. The desert was unpredictable, and predators roamed these parts more freely than anyone realized. Every rustle of wind or scatter of pebbles put him on edge. He occasionally shone the flashlight over the plateau's edge, scanning the darkness for movement. The night stretched on, each minute a test of endurance. The smell of ozone from the storm mixed with the metallic tang of blood. His heart felt heavy in his chest, weighted by fear and uncertainty, but he wouldn't give in. As the rain subsided, he noticed how the Mustang's breathing steadied slightly. That was good. Maybe the makeshift bandage was helping to stanch the bleeding. He could do nothing but wait, watch, and gather his strength. Shadows loomed in every corner of his vision, occasionally shifting in the storm's dying gusts. It was a night of raw survival, with man and horse forging a fragile partnership under the relentless watch of nature's unforgiving eyes. He tested his leg, wincing at the pain in his knee from the earlier fall. It throbbed with each heartbeat, but compared to the horse's injury it seemed minor. He reached down, rolling up his pant leg to see a bruise forming, the skin tender. One more problem among many, yet he reminded himself that he'd survived worse in the past. He had to keep telling himself that, had to maintain the belief that dawn would come, and with it, a chance to find real help. The Mustang shifted, letting out a low rumble of discomfort. He wanted to comfort the horse, to offer some wordless reassurance, but he remained still. Any sudden movement might startle it. They were bound together by circumstance, each vulnerable, each reliant on the other in a hostile wilderness. The wind whistled between the rocks, and the temperature dropped again, biting at exposed skin. He checked his watch, though it was useless. He had no idea how many hours until sunrise. The darkness felt eternal. Eventually, the storm clouds drifted, revealing a faint shimmer of stars overhead. The moon was a pale crescent, providing just enough light to cast ghostly shapes across the plateau. He looked at the Mustang again, noticing how it seemed to watch him in return. The horse's sides rose and fell steadily, and its ears weren't pinned back anymore. That small change filled him with a fragile sense of relief. Maybe the horse understood he wasn't a threat, that they were in this together. Or maybe it was simply too tired to care. Either way, they coexisted in the hush of night, surrounded by the unknown. He tightened the emergency blanket around his shoulders, wishing he had something for the horse, hay, or at least a heavier wrap, something to help it retain warmth. But there was nothing but rocks, sparse vegetation, and the battered remains of his own gear. A wave of guilt washed over him. This animal had been trapped by cruelty, left to suffer. Now that he'd intervened, it was his responsibility to see it through. He wouldn't abandon the horse, no matter how dire the circumstances. His eyes drifted to the dark horizon, trying to pierce the gloom for any sign of movement. Each flicker of lightning had revealed only empty desert, but that didn't guarantee safety. Silence could be deceiving. He clutched the flashlight, finger on the switch, ready to shine it at the first sign of approaching danger. The tension in his muscles refused to ease. Adrenaline kept him awake, but it also left him shaky and on edge. After what felt like an eternity, the night sky began to lighten, just a fraction. A faint glow on the eastern edge, barely perceptible. Dawn was coming. He felt a surge of cautious optimism. If they could just make it to daylight, he could attempt to navigate toward a known path, or a water source. Maybe they'd find a safe route back to civilization. But the journey would be brutal. The Mustang's leg was in no condition for a long trek. He wondered if the horse would even have the strength to walk a mile, let alone the distance they might need to cover to find help. He huddled there, counting heartbeats, as the darkness slowly receded. The Mustang lifted its head, ears pricking at the change in light. The dawn revealed the battered state of their surroundings. The plateau was littered with debris from the storm, broken branches, scattered pebbles, and puddles of water reflecting the sky's early glow. The horse's coat looked matted with mud and blood, and his own clothes were torn and filthy. Yet they were alive. For now, that was enough. With dawn came renewed urgency. The predators that roamed at night might disperse, but new dangers awaited in the scorching heat of day, especially if the storm clouds cleared. Dehydration, sun exposure, and the horses' bleeding could all spell disaster if they didn't move soon. He eased himself onto his feet, ignoring the protest from his knee. The Mustang eyed him warily, its ears flicking at his movements. He forced a smile he didn't feel. "Easy," he murmured, extending his hand. The horse pawed the ground once, as if testing its weight. It sniffed the air, lips curling back slightly. Now came the real test. Could the Mustang walk on that injured leg? If not, they were trapped on the plateau. He moved closer, gently checking the bandage. Crimson had seeped through in a few places, but it wasn't gushing. That was a good sign. He spoke in a calm, low tone, encouraging the horse to take a step. The Mustang whickered softly, ears half forward in uncertainty. Slowly, it shifted weight onto the wounded leg. The muscles tensed under the bandage, but the horse managed a shaky step, then another. He couldn't believe it. Relief flooded him, though he knew they were far from out of the woods. The horse still limped heavily. He'd have to guide it carefully down the rocky path they'd climbed during the storm. One misstep, and they could tumble down the canyon face. He considered his options. If he stayed, they risked another encounter with predators. If he moved on, the Mustang might aggravate the injury. Neither choice was ideal, but he sensed that staying put would be a worse gamble. Gathering what courage remained, he picked up his pack, tested his flashlight, and tossed the spent bandages that couldn't be reused. Then, with a reassuring pat on the horse's neck, he started leading the way down the slope. The descent was treacherous. The rocks were slick from the rain, and the Mustang stumbled a few times, each slip sending a jolt of fear through him. The rope around his waist was more symbolic than functional. He couldn't restrain a wild horse if it truly panicked. But it gave a semblance of unity, as they navigated the twisting path. Morning light continued to creep across the desert, unveiling the damage left by the storm. Pools of muddy water reflected the rising sun, and the ground shimmered with a fresh coat of moisture. In a few hours, the heat would bake it all away, and they'd be left with the same arid expanse. Step by step, they reached the canyon floor. Loose rocks tumbled with every footfall. He glanced around, searching for a sign of a trail, a path, even a faint one carved by animals. He'd traveled these parts before, but never this deep. Time felt elastic, stretching with each labored breath and each pained step the Mustang took. The thirst in his throat became acute. He sipped from his flask, only to find it nearly empty. He stared at the few remaining drops, feeling panic build. Without water, he wouldn't last long in this desert, let alone a wounded horse. He forced his thoughts away from despair. Focus on the next step, he told himself. One challenge at a time. The Mustang huffed beside him, limping but determined. They were both battered, exhausted, and vulnerable, but they were still moving. That meant everything. The sky overhead was clearing, revealing a brilliant blue that heralded intense heat. They needed shelter, or at least a route that might lead them to a river or stream. He scanned the land, noting a line of greenish brush in the distance, a potential sign of water. Hope stirred in his chest. If they could reach that line of vegetation, maybe they'd find a creek or a seep. They trekked on, the Mustang's pace slow but steady. The sun climbed, beating down with relentless force. Sweat soaked his shirt, and he felt the sting of salt in the cuts on his arms. Flies buzzed around the horse's wound, and he tried to brush them away with a branch, but it was a losing battle. The land felt endless, a sea of rolling dirt and scattered rocks with no definitive markers. A sense of isolation pressed on him. This was raw nature, indifferent to his survival, or the horse's. After what felt like hours, the faint green line of brush revealed itself as a shallow gulch, half filled with muddy water from the storm's runoff. It wasn't much, but it was a lifeline. He knelt at the edge, cupping the brownish liquid in his hands, letting the grit settle before sipping. It tasted stale and earthy, but it was water. He offered some to the Mustang, which drank greedily, muzzle darkening with mud. He watched with relief as the horse lapped up as much as it could handle. The bandage on its leg was holding, though it was caked in dirt and filthy water. He'd have to rewrap it, but at least they'd found something to keep them going. Refreshed, though not rejuvenated, they moved on along the gulch. Each step grew heavier, the sun forging overhead. The man's senses were on high alert, scanning for any hint of danger. The Mustang's ears flicked at every rustle. He knew predators often lurked near water sources. But luck seemed to favor them for the moment. The only creatures they spotted were smaller desert dwellers, lizards darting under rocks, birds squawking overhead. His thoughts turned to how they might reach real help. The nearest outpost was days away by foot, if he was guessing correctly. The horse, in its current state, likely couldn't make that trek. He pictured the bandage unraveling, the wound opening, a trail of blood leading predators right to them. He tried to push that image away. Survival meant focusing on the immediate. They needed shade and safer ground for the Mustang to rest. Then, maybe, he could figure out a signal or a way to get help. He recalled that some ranchers and rescue workers sometimes patrolled these outer lands for lost hikers or wounded animals. If he could find an old fence line, a worn trail, or some other sign of human presence, he might be able to follow it. The sun's position told him it was still late morning. They had time before the heat reached its peak, but not much. He pressed on, ignoring the throbbing in his knee, the ache in his muscles, and the dryness in his mouth that returned too quickly. He noticed the Mustang's gait worsen. The horse was favoring the injured leg more and more. Each step was agonizing to watch. They needed to find a place to hole up, at least to redress the wound. Scanning the horizon, he saw a cluster of rocks forming a natural overhang. It wasn't large, but it might offer respite from the sun. With gentle tugs on the rope, he steered the Mustang in that direction. The horse followed, though its snorts conveyed discomfort. The ground underfoot became rocky again, but they managed to reach the overhang. Beneath the shade, the temperature dropped a fraction, enough to grant a little relief. He guided the Mustang to a sandy patch and let it lie down. The horse folded its legs carefully, exhaling a labored breath. He knelt beside it, gingerly undoing the filthy bandage. Blood oozed, but it didn't gush. That was progress. He cleaned the wound as best he could with the limited supplies, cursing under his breath at the magnitude of the gash. Infection was a real threat if they didn't get professional care soon. He was at a loss. Here he was, in the middle of nowhere, with a severely injured horse and no immediate way to call for help. But something in the Mustang's eyes steeled his resolve. He improvised with the last of his antiseptic and layered a fresh wrap from torn pieces of his shirt. The horse flinched but stayed still, occasionally resting its muzzle on his arm in a strange gesture of acceptance. Or maybe it was just too tired to resist. Either way, it felt like a moment of fragile trust between man and beast. Outside, the sun edged toward noon, the light glaring off rocks and sand. He squinted, scanning the horizon for any sign of movement, human or otherwise. There was nothing. Just an endless desert with a silent promise that something could be lurking just out of sight. He tried to think of a plan, but his mind was clouded by fatigue and worry. Maybe they should stay put until nightfall, then travel under the cooler temperatures. But that risked encountering nocturnal predators. Or they could push on now, risking the heat. It was a lose-lose situation. In the end, he decided to wait for a bit, to let the horse rest, to let himself rest. He found a small patch of shade, sat back against the rock, and closed his eyes for a moment. The horse's rhythmic breathing lulled him into a light doze, though he fought to stay aware. He jolted awake at the sound of shifting pebbles. Heart racing, he clutched his knife, scanning the area. Nothing. Probably just a trickle of sand dislodged by the wind. He forced himself to breathe, adrenaline coursing through him again, making his limbs tremble. The hours blurred. The horse dozed fitfully. He rationed what water he could collect from small puddles left by the storm. Then, late in the afternoon, when the sun started to dip, he resolved to press on once more. Gathering his scattered belongings, he coaxed the Mustang to its feet. The horse stood with effort, foam gathering around its mouth from stress. The trek resumed, the desert blazing orange under the slanting rays of evening light. Each step was a painful reminder of their mortality. The man felt the dryness in his throat, the sting of new blisters on his feet, the churn of hunger in his stomach. His supplies were nearly gone, replaced by an urgent sense of desperation. Yet they moved forward. He kept searching for any clue of civilization, hoof prints, wagon tracks, even a broken fence post. The land was silent except for the crunch of their footsteps and the Mustang's labored snorts. Shadows lengthened, turning the world into a patchwork of light and dark. His body begged for rest, but his mind wouldn't let him stop. Each time the horse stumbled, his heart lurched. He'd place a steadying hand on its flank, whispering encouragement. It was surreal, this fragile bond formed under the threat of death at every turn. Just as the last light bled from the sky, he noticed a faint trail winding through the brush. It looked like it had once been used, maybe by ranchers or wild animals, though it was now partially overgrown. Hope surged in his chest. If they followed that trail, maybe it would lead somewhere. He turned to the Mustang, giving the rope a gentle tug. The horse's ears perked, as if sensing the shift in his mood. They started along the trail, the night air cooling them, but also heightening the sense of vulnerability. Darkness came swiftly, a thick curtain across the land. He flicked on his flashlight, its beam weak against the encroaching blackness. He tried to walk quietly, mindful that the horse's limp was more pronounced now, each step heavier. The trail twisted around craggy outcrops and descended into a shallow valley. The wind carried a strange scent, damp earth mixed with something metallic. A primal fear stirred in him, an irrational worry that there might be more traps or something worse. The Mustang hesitated, snorting at the darkness. He whispered reassuring words, though the trembling in his own voice betrayed his fear. Then came the first distant howl. It echoed across the rocks, reverberating in the still night air. Wolves! His blood ran cold. He knew they roamed these parts, especially after storms, when they picked off weakened prey. And here they were, one man, a wounded Mustang, no real weapons. He struggled to remain calm, scanning with the flashlight, but saw nothing. The howling came again, this time answered by another. The pack was assembling. He felt sweat break out on his forehead, despite the cold. His mouth went dry, and his heart hammered in his chest, each beat a drum signaling he was still alive, for now. He urged the Mustang forward, picking up the pace. The horse limped faster, ears pinned back in alarm. The howls grew closer, each one twisting his nerves. In the flashlight's peripheral, he thought he saw glinting eyes, but when he turned, they vanished. Fear coiled in his belly. He clenched the knife in his hand, though he knew it was inadequate. The canyon walls loomed overhead, casting deep shadows. The path narrowed, forcing them into single file. If the wolves attacked now, they'd have little room to maneuver. A sudden snarl cut through the silence, followed by the rapid patter of paws on rock. The Mustang screamed in terror, rearing up and almost toppling over. He whipped the flashlight around, catching a glimpse of a lean, gray form launching itself at them, teeth bared. Reflex took over. He brandished the knife, slashing wildly. The wolf veered off, but not before snapping at his arm. He felt the teeth scrape his skin, but adrenaline blocked out the pain. Another pair of eyes appeared behind the first, glowing with predatory hunger. The horse kicked, hooves thundering against the ground. The second wolf snarled, circling around to flank them. It was chaos in the dark. The flashlight swung wildly, beams of light cutting jagged arcs through the blackness. The wolves darted in and out, cunning and swift. The Mustang bucked, nearly yanking the rope from his hand. The man screamed, a raw sound born of desperation, brandishing the knife at the snapping jaws. The lead wolf lunged again, this time aiming for the horse's injured leg. In a burst of protective instinct, the man threw himself in the wolf's path, knife outstretched. He felt the impact as the wolf collided with the blade, yelping in pain. Blood splattered across his hand, hot and slick. The wolf retreated, limping into the darkness, but its pack mates were still there. Another wolf seized the moment and leapt onto a boulder behind him, ready to spring. The Mustang spun, eyes wild, delivering a vicious double kick that connected with the animal's side. A crack resounded in the narrow canyon, and the wolf was hurled against the rocks. It slumped, whimpering, before scrambling away, tail low. But more howls echoed, and the man knew the pack was larger than just these two. Danger pressed in from all sides. Each second was a delicate dance between life and death. The Mustang trembled, sweat foaming on its neck despite the cold. He tightened his grip on the rope, urging them forward, desperate to escape the ambush sight. They stumbled down the trail, with wolves snapping at their heels. Occasionally, one would rush forward, forcing him to swing the knife or for the Mustang to lash out with its good legs. Neither man nor horse could keep this up for long. Blood pounded in his ears, and every shallow breath burned. His wounded arm ached fiercely, and he could feel warm blood trickling down to his elbow. Still, he pressed on, fear giving him a jolt of savage strength. The Mustang, guided by terror and survival instinct, limped with renewed vigor. They needed to find a defensible position, anywhere they could fend off the pack. Up ahead, the canyon walls opened into a small clearing dotted with scrub brush. The moon emerged from behind a cloud, casting a faint silvery glow over the area. He spotted a large boulder formation in the center, towering high with a flat top. If they could climb that, they might gain the high ground. He tugged hard on the rope, pulling the Mustang with him, heart hammering as the wolves closed in. At least 4 or 5 sets of eyes glinted in the darkness. His gut clenched at the realization that the rest of the pack had joined the hunt. He and the horse raced toward the boulder, the Mustang whimpering with each jolting step. The wolves fanned out in a half-circle, cutting off escape routes. They were intelligent, operating as a unit. He tightened his jaw, refusing to let the panic consume him. The boulder loomed, its surfaces rough but climbable. A wolf lunged at them from the left, snapping at the Mustang's flank. The horse squealed in fright, lashed out, catching the wolf across the jaw. Another wolf sprinted in from the right, forcing the man to swing his knife. The blade nicked the creature's muzzle, drawing a spatter of dark blood. The wolf yelped but didn't back down. Somehow, they made it to the base of the boulder. The rock's incline was steep, and the Mustang struggled to find footing. "Come on!" he shouted hoarsely, though he wasn't sure of whom he was encouraging, the horse or himself. One wolf leapt, claws scraping the rock, trying to get behind them. He kicked at it, nearly losing his balance. The Mustang reared, hooves flailing, forging a path. With the adrenaline surge, the man pressed his back against the horse's flank, working together in a frantic, terrifying dance of survival. Inch by inch, they clawed their way onto a broad ledge. The Mustang scrambled, powerful muscles trembling under the strain. The wolves snapped at their heels, missing by inches. He hauled himself up, nearly dropping the knife in the process, then turned to help the Mustang. Gripping the rope, he pulled with every ounce of strength he had left, ignoring the burning pain in his arm. The horse kicked and fought to find purchase. His muscles screamed in protest, but the Mustang finally scrambled onto the ledge beside him. The wolves rushed the base, snarling and snapping, but they couldn't immediately scale the vertical face. He collapsed onto his side, gasping for breath, the Mustang breathing hot gusts of air beside him. His pulse roared in his ears, and sweat poured down his temples. For a split second, they were safe. Then the alpha wolf appeared below, a massive animal with a scar across its muzzle. Its eyes glowed in the moonlight, and it emitted a low growl that sent shivers down the man's spine. Other wolves circled, searching for a vantage point. He staggered to his feet, pulling the Mustang further back from the edge. The ledge was wide enough for them to stand, but not much else. If the wolves found a way up, they'd be cornered. He gripped the knife, knuckles white, scanning for an escape. The boulder extended behind them, offering a slightly higher platform if they could climb it. He swallowed hard, aware that the horse was terrified and already near its limit. A savage snarl erupted as one of the wolves tried to leap onto a protruding rock near the ledge. The Mustang kicked out blindly. The blow connected, sending the wolf tumbling back. Another wolf darted around to the side. The man whipped the flashlight beam across the stone, revealing a small gap that might serve as a ramp. His stomach tightened. If the wolves found that ramp, they'd be on the ledge in seconds. They had to climb higher. But the Mustang was limping badly, its leg quivering with every movement. Desperation fueled him. He tugged at the rope, guiding the horse to the next incline. The rock was jagged enough to provide footholds. The Mustang, snorting in fear, followed his lead, stomping at the slightest sound of a wolf drawing near. Each step was an ordeal, but they gained a few more precious feet. Wolves circled below like sharks around a wounded seal, hungry and relentless. The alpha wolf howled, the sound reverberating off the canyon walls. The rest of the pack joined in, their eerie chorus filling the night. They reached a narrow plateau, the highest point on the rock formation. Below them, the wolves prowled. The man could see their eyes glinting as they tested different routes, occasionally leaping up on smaller rocks. Some managed to scale half the distance before sliding back. He shuddered, realizing that eventually, the wolves might find a path. He and the Mustang were perched on a precarious island of stone, with no easy escape. The wind gusted, carrying the scent of blood and sweat away into the night. His knife felt pitiful in his hand. He wondered how many swipes he had left in him if the wolves came in force. The Mustang pressed close, flanks shivering. He could feel the horse's heart pounding under its skin, a frantic rhythm that matched his own. They were both on the brink of exhaustion, bodies and minds stretched to their limits. He gritted his teeth, refusing to surrender to the terror surging in his veins. He had to believe they could make it. He had to. In the silence that followed the howls, he heard the horse's ragged breathing and his own gasps for air. The night air was cold, but sweat slicked every inch of his skin. He glanced around, desperate for anything, a loose boulder they could roll down onto the wolves, a gap that led to a hidden path. The moon slid behind a cloud, plunging them into darkness again. Shadows played tricks on his eyes, and every rustle of gravel sounded like an approaching predator. He realized then just how close death lurked. One slip, one moment of inattention, and the wolves would be upon them. But something inside him refused to yield. He steadied his breathing, ignoring the stabbing pain in his wounded arm. The Mustang let out a plaintive sound, something between a whinny and a groan. He placed a trembling hand on the horse's neck, feeling the dampness of its coat, the tension of its muscles. "We're in this together," he whispered, though his voice was lost in the wind. Below them, the alpha wolf padded around the base of the formation, never taking its eyes off them. The tension was suffocating. The rest of the pack lurked in the shadows, occasionally snarling or snapping at each other. Hours seemed to pass like this, a stalemate with no resolution in sight. Every so often, a wolf would attempt to climb closer, only to be repelled by the man's frantic waving of the flashlight or the horse's protective kicks. But how long could they keep that up? His throat felt raw from thirst, his body screaming for rest. But he couldn't let himself sleep, not even for a second. The Mustang needed him alert. They were perched on a ledge that offered no cushion, no comfort. The slightest slip of the hoof or shift in weight, and they could tumble off. The thought of dying in a fall or being torn apart by wolves down below made his heart pound even harder. He thought back to how this all started, that moment he'd heard the Mustang's cry and decided he had to intervene. Fate, coincidence, or just the stubbornness of a man who couldn't walk away from a suffering creature. Now it was a battle for both their lives, with no guarantee of rescue. He almost laughed at the absurdity of it, but the sound caught in his throat, turning into a rasping cough. The Mustang's ears swiveled, picking up on his distress. The horse nudged him lightly, as if questioning whether he was okay. Dawn felt like 1,000,000 miles away, but he clung to the hope that daylight might disperse the pack or at least give them a chance to find a better refuge. He prayed silently that they could hold out. The alpha wolf growled below, pacing back and forth. Those intelligent eyes suggested it was strategizing, waiting for the right moment to strike. He steeled himself, scanning for a possible next move. There was a line of boulders leading away from the formation, but it looked even more perilous than where they stood now. If they tried to navigate that path in the dark, they risked falling or losing the Mustang to a misstep. And so they waited, locked in a grim standstill as the night wore on. Each breath was a shallow, trembling draw. Each minute stretched unbearably, fraught with the threat of an attack. The man's grip on the knife tightened until his knuckles ached. The Mustang's breathing slowed to a pained pant. He could only imagine the toll this ordeal was taking on the horse's wounded leg. Fear was a constant hum in the back of his mind, punctuated by jolts of raw terror each time the wolves tried to creep closer. At some point, the alpha wolf let out another piercing howl, summoning the pack. They responded in a haunting chorus that reverberated in the canyon. The man swallowed hard, bracing for the final assault. His fingers trembled around the hilt of the knife, the Mustang coiling its muscles in readiness to kick. Then, abruptly, the wolves broke rank. With a flurry of snarls and dark shapes, they darted toward the boulder, some leaping onto smaller rocks, others circling around to find a different route. The alpha wolf locked eyes with him, and he felt a chill that went beyond the physical cold. This was it. Heart pounding, he raised the flashlight in one hand, the knife in the other. The Mustang snorted, ears flattened, teeth bared in a display of equine aggression. As one wolf scrambled up a rocky ledge, the man lunged forward, swiping the knife. He connected with flesh, and the wolf yelped, sliding back down. Another sprang from the side, forcing the horse to rear and kick. The impact echoed through the stone. For a terrifying moment, the man lost his balance, arms pinwheeling, knife slicing empty air. He landed hard on his side, gasping as pain flared in his bruised knee. Wolves pressed their advantage. One snapped at the Mustang's flank, drawing blood. The horse screamed, lashing out, connecting with the wolf's rib cage. The creature flew backward, crashing into another that was mid-lunge. He scrambled to his feet, ignoring the pain, and slashed at a third wolf that lunged at him. Fur bristled and teeth gnashed. He felt the rank, hot breath on his neck. Adrenaline took over. He stabbed viciously, tears stinging his eyes from the force of his fear. The alpha wolf bounded closer, jaws parted to reveal razor-sharp teeth. He swung the flashlight, cracking it against the wolf's muzzle. A savage yelp followed, but the wolf snapped at his hand, tearing the flashlight away. It clattered down the rocks. Panic blinded him. Now they were cloaked in near darkness, with only the faint moonlight to guide them. He heard the Mustang's frantic whinnies, the scrape of hooves on rocks, snarls, and yelps. It was a brutal cacophony of survival. Desperate, he reached out, touching the Mustang's shoulder. The horse jerked but recognized him, shifting so that they stood almost back to back. For a second, man and horse united in a primal stand against the wolves. He felt the Mustang's powerful body coil, muscles rippling as it prepared to defend itself. A wolf lunged from behind, and the horse kicked without hesitation, hooves connecting with a sickening crack. The wolf toppled away, rolling into the darkness. Then the alpha wolf came again, a ghostly shape in the moonlight, eyes burning with hunger and fury. The man knew this would be the deciding moment. He braced himself, knife at the ready, while the Mustang gathered its strength for a final strike. Time seemed to slow as the wolf lunged. He thrust the knife forward, feeling the blade bite into fur and flesh. Simultaneously, the Mustang reared and drove its hooves into the wolf's side, sending the creature sprawling. The alpha wolf hit the ground hard, letting out a guttural snarl, then scrambled to its feet, limping away into the gloom. The pack hesitated, confusion rippling through them as their leader retreated, wounded. One by one, the wolves began to back off, growling and snapping at each other in frustration. Blood mingled with the dusty rock, some of it the man's, some the horse's, some the wolves'. The savage dance of combat had taken its toll. With their alpha injured and the resistance unexpectedly fierce, the pack seemed uncertain. In a flurry of snarls, they melted back into the darkness, leaving man and horse trembling on the high ledge, battered but alive. His breath came in ragged gasps, and his arms felt like lead. He nearly collapsed, but the Mustang's quivering form kept him alert. He pressed a hand to his side, feeling warm blood. He didn't even know where it came from. The horse's flank was streaked with fresh wounds, but none looked immediately fatal. A brittle silence followed, broken only by the wind and the soft scrape of the Mustang's hooves. The pack's howls faded into the distance, echoing off the canyon walls. He sank to his knees, chest heaving. The Mustang stood over him, sides heaving with exhaustion. Stars dotted the sky, and the moon continued its silent vigil. He closed his eyes for just a moment, letting the enormity of their survival sink in. They were alive, wounded, exhausted, but alive. Tears blurred his vision, fueled by relief and the sheer terror of what they'd just endured. Gritting his teeth against the pain, he reached out and placed a shaking hand on the Mustang's neck. The horse didn't flinch. Instead, it lowered its head, muzzle quivering. The gesture felt like gratitude, or at least an acknowledgement that they had fought side by side, each saving the other from certain death. They stayed like that for a moment, a quiet bond forged in the fires of survival. Then he gathered what strength he had left, guiding the Mustang back down the boulder to where he'd dropped the flashlight. It was broken, battered from the wolf's jaws, but it still flickered faintly. That tiny light gave him enough to see the path. With the wolves gone for now, they needed to find shelter again. The horse limped badly, leaving a trail of blood and sweat. He kept a hand on its flank, murmuring soft reassurances he could barely hear over the pounding of his own heart. Dawn was still hours away, but they couldn't afford to remain on exposed rock, not after that harrowing ordeal. He forced himself to keep moving, despite the pain in every muscle, scanning for a nook or crevice in the canyon wall. Eventually, they found a small indentation, just large enough to offer some protection. He coaxed the Mustang inside, then collapsed next to it, knife still clutched in his trembling hand. Exhaustion engulfed him. His body screamed for rest, but his mind buzzed with the lingering fear of another attack. Before he could think too much, darkness closed in, and he drifted into a fitful, haunted sleep. When he woke, the sun was peeking over the horizon, painting the canyon in soft hues of pink and gold. Every limb ached, and dried blood clung to his skin. He slowly sat up, wincing at his injuries. Next to him, the Mustang stirred, letting out a low nicker. Its wounds looked dire, but it was alive, eyes half-lidded with exhaustion. He placed a hand on its shoulder, feeling the steady rise and fall of its ribcage. "We made it," he whispered, voice cracking. They had survived one of the fiercest nights of their lives. But they still had a long way to go. The day promised scorching heat, and they had precious little water. The man forced himself to focus on the next steps. Maybe they could find a real trail, an old ranch line, or a spot with a better vantage to signal for help. Every movement was agony, but he refused to succumb to despair. The Mustang, for all its injuries, seemed equally determined. There was a grit in its stance, a stubborn life force that mirrored his own. With deep breaths, he began tending to their wounds as best he could. He tore another piece from his shirt to press against a bleeding scratch on his arm. For the horse, he replaced the bandage on its leg, though now he had even fewer supplies. The memory of the previous night's battle flickered in his mind. He wiped away tears he hadn't realized were falling. It wasn't just the physical pain that left him shaken. It was the realization that they'd come so close to death, only to emerge battered but stronger in some intangible way. Moving on was their only option. He coaxed the Mustang to stand, which it did with a tremor of effort. Together they stepped out into the early morning light, each unsure of what new trials might await. A fragile determination guided them as they began again. Step by step, they followed the canyon, hoping the path would lead them to a place of safety, or at least a sign that they weren't the only souls left in this harsh land. In the distance, he spotted a faint plume of smoke rising against the dawn sky. It was far, possibly miles away, but it was a human signal. Renewed hope surged in him. He gently tugged on the rope, turning to the Mustang with a soft smile that cracked his dusty lips. "Let's go," he said quietly. The horse flicked its ears, the pain evident in its gaze, but it stepped forward. Man and Mustang together again, heading toward an uncertain future yet bound by a shared resolve to survive. As they walked, he couldn't help but recall the horse's eyes in the midst of that wolf attack, fire and fear, strength and desperation. The connection that night had forged something deeper than mere chance. Whatever happened now, he knew they had already beaten impossible odds. And that simple truth gave him the will to take another step, and another, the horse limping by his side, both of them carrying wounds that told a story of survival no one else could truly understand. The trek was slow, painfully so, each of them near the brink of collapse. But with every labored breath and each carefully placed footstep, the plume of smoke drew closer. Maybe it was a campfire, a ranch house, or a rescue team. He didn't know, but he clung to that hope like a lifeline. The Mustang huffed, ears twitching at the faint scent of something beyond the desert's emptiness. The sun rose higher, scorching them again, but they pressed on, driven by the promise of aid. Eventually, they crested a small rise and looked down into a shallow valley. Nestled among scrub trees and rocks, a dilapidated cabin stood with a thin curl of smoke emanating from a crooked chimney. Relief nearly buckled his knees. He guided the Mustang down, tears threatening to overflow again. He prayed whoever was inside wouldn't turn them away. As they approached, a figure emerged, an old rancher, eyes squinting in confusion at the sight of a half-dead man leading a wounded wild Mustang. But confusion quickly turned to concern as the rancher rushed forward. The next moments passed in a blur. The rancher ushered them inside a small fenced area, offering water and basic medical supplies. The Mustang stood warily, but too exhausted to resist as the rancher examined its wounds. The man himself was led to a bench, where he nearly collapsed from relief. Words tumbled from his lips, a rushed explanation of the trap, the wolves, the fight for survival. The rancher listened intently, nodding, then set about doing what he could to patch them both up. He offered the man a battered old radio, promising they'd call for veterinary help and maybe a local rescue. There was a battered first aid kit on a rickety table, enough to clean and stitch some of the deeper wounds. As the morning stretched on, a wave of safety washed over him. The Mustang was in better hands now, someone who at least knew a thing or two about horses. He let himself sink into a worn chair, fatigue overtaking every muscle. But every few minutes he'd glance out the window, making sure the horse was still there, alive, its chest still rising and falling. Through the haze of exhaustion, he saw the rancher speaking softly to the Mustang, offering it water and gently stroking its neck. Time slipped away until, at last, he drifted into a deep, dreamless sleep. When he awoke, the sun was higher, and the rancher was at the table, scribbling on a notepad. Outside, the Mustang rested in a corral, bandages covering its wounds. The man stumbled to his feet, pressing a hand to his still aching ribs. He stepped out onto the porch, blinking in the bright light. The Mustang lifted its head, ears forward. Its eyes met his, and he could almost sense gratitude in that gaze. Tears threatened again, but this time they were of relief, not fear. The rancher approached with a nod. "Vet's on the way," he said simply. "Horse is strong. Might just pull through." The man could barely speak, choking out a hoarse "Thank you." The rancher patted him on the shoulder, then went back to his notepad. The man turned back to the Mustang, stepping up to the corral fence. He reached out a cautious hand over the top rail. The horse limped over, nudging his palm with a softness that belied its wild nature. His chest tightened, memories of their shared struggle flashing behind his eyes, the trap, the endless desert, the wolf attack, the desperate climb to the boulder. He felt a tear slide down his cheek. For a moment neither man nor horse moved. This was a fragile truce between two battered souls who had faced death together. The horse bobbed its head, lips quivering as if trying to speak. And for the man, it was more than enough. The tears came freely now, hot streaks down his dust-caked face. The rancher looked on quietly, understanding perhaps better than anyone what such a moment meant. It was a connection forged in adversity, a bond that transcended fear. The Mustang had allowed him into its world, and in saving each other, they had discovered a hidden well of courage and empathy within themselves. As the man stroked the horse's muzzle, he whispered words that scarcely made sense, but were steeped in raw emotion, apologies for the pain, gratitude for the trust, awe at the resilience they'd both displayed. The Mustang blinked slowly, leaning into his touch. In that simple gesture, it conveyed a profound acceptance. They might never fully tame each other, might never forget the terror of that night, but they had survived. And in that survival lay hope, the promise of life continuing against the odds. He heard the distant rumble of a truck engine. The vet arriving, perhaps. Help had finally come. The rancher stepped away to flag them down, leaving the man and the Mustang alone in their moment of reckoning. He looked into the horse's deep eyes one last time. A wave of gratitude, relief, and overwhelming emotion welled up within him. Tears slipped down his face, silent tributes to the trials they had overcome. The Mustang lifted its head, ears flicking, as if acknowledging the tears were not a sign of weakness but of humanity. And at that realization, the man was undone, burying his face against the horse's mane, shoulders shaking. When at last he pulled away, he inhaled a shuddering breath, wiping his cheeks with the back of his hand. The Mustang gave a soft snort, resting its nose against his shoulder for a fleeting heartbeat. Then, with a subtle shift of its weight, it stood on its own, injured, yes, but undeniably alive. The man stepped back, letting the horse have its space. His chest felt both hollow and full, as though he'd left a piece of himself in that desert, yet gained something immeasurable in return. A voice called out behind him. It was the rancher, beckoning the vet over. The man nodded, mustering a weary smile, knowing the horse was in capable hands now. He moved aside as the vet entered the corral, carrying a medical kit. The Mustang snorted but didn't shy away. This time, it seemed to sense that help was at hand, that the threat of further pain was tempered by the promise of true healing. The man watched, heart tight, as the vet began to examine the horse. A short while later, the vet approached him. "It's got a nasty wound on that leg, but we can fix it. Good thing you got it out of that trap. Another day or two, and it might have been too late." The words washed over him like a balm, filling him with a trembling sense of closure. He nodded, voice still choked with emotion. "Thank you," was all he managed. The vet gave him a kind pat on the back, then returned to work. The rancher offered the man a seat and some water, which he accepted gratefully, gulping down the liquid that revived him. When he looked at the Mustang again, it was standing quietly, allowing the vet to apply salve and fresh bandages. He watched, tears still burning at the corners of his eyes, remembering the hopeless moment when he'd first encountered the horse tangled in that trap. How far they'd come since then, from terror to trust, from near death to a second chance. The rancher stepped over, leaning on the fence. "Hell of a thing you did," he said, voice gruff. "Not many folks would put themselves in that kind of danger for a wild horse." The man exhaled unsteadily. "I couldn't leave it to die like that," he whispered. "I didn't save it. We saved each other." Quiet settled between them, a companionable silence that spoke volumes. The rancher nodded, as if that was all he needed to hear. The man rose on shaky legs, approaching the corral once more. The Mustang glanced his way, ears perking. Though it was still wild at heart, some barrier had been breached between them. He reached out, and the horse let him stroke its neck gently. In that shared touch, he felt all the nights of fear, the battles with wolves, the exhaustion, and the desperate hope. He smiled through fresh tears, a smile born of survival and raw gratitude. He remembered then that there were people out there, maybe even those watching right now, who had no idea of the life-or-death struggle they'd endured. He took a breath, clearing his throat. And he spoke softly, as if addressing an unseen audience, his voice worn and cracked. "If this story touched your heart, if you felt what we felt out there, please remember to like this video, subscribe, and share it with those who might need a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there's still a chance for hope." He let the words hang in the desert air, the final chord of a story that had nearly ended in tragedy but was instead a testament to endurance and compassion. He wasn't sure what tomorrow would bring for him or for the Mustang, but for now, they had this moment. A new day stretched ahead, filled with unknown possibilities. The man wrapped his arms around himself, hugging tight against the overwhelming surge of emotion. The Mustang blinked, tail swishing, as if to say it was ready for whatever lay ahead. And for the first time since entering that canyon, the man felt at peace. Because they had survived, they had fought for life, and in the end, they had earned the right to face another sunrise. If this story made your heart race or brought a tear to your eye, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe for more daily survival tales, and share this video with someone who needs a reminder that courage and kindness can overcome even the fiercest storms. Until next time, take care of each other, and never underestimate the power of compassion in the face of danger.